Oh, I wasn't ready. It's on?
Okay.
All right. Have you ever felt that if you revealed your secret sins to your religious leaders, they would kick you out of their congregation? Have you ever felt that if anyone knew what you did in secret, they would abandon you so fast it would cause some kind of time warp? Have you ever wondered if your religious leaders have some secret sins in their own lives? Or do you think they are all perfect? If you knew that one of the leaders of your congregation was involved in some kind of bad sin, what would you do? Would it make you mad? Would you give that person a piece of your mind? Would you ask that person to step down? Do you think that person should step down without being asked? Should a person like this be allowed to continue service? Or should a person like that step down until that person gets his or her life back together? The name of this message is A Loathsome Disease. Please stand and cover yourselves for the reading of our scriptures. For those of you who don't know, I'm tethered. I've got wires hooked up to me and things like that, so I can't stand. It is not a command of God that we stand. It's just that our Lord and his Talmudim, his disciples, they all stood and covered their heads when the scriptures were read, just a sign of respect. They did it when they prayed. They did it when there was a prophecy, which is a teaching. Because biblically, prophecy was different than what prophecy has become in the Christian world today. Well, really in the Western world at large. Even among some Jews, they've gotten into the Western idea of prophecy. But anyway, we cover up because if the Lord did it, it's got to be good enough for us. Our verse today comes from Tehillim, which we know as Psalms in the Western world. It's chapter 38, verse 4. And it says, Ki avonotai avru roshi ke masa haver, like haverim, haver, like friend, yich bedu mimani. All right, you may be seated. So we begin with the word ki, which is the Hebrew word for, choose for, or because, sometimes even used for the word if. So generally it's the word for, F-O-R. Then we follow that with avonotai, which is iniquities. And the tie is at the end, the I sound is my. So literally it's iniquities my, but we say in English, my iniquities. Iniquities, they say, are perversity, it's depravity, a depraved action, a crime, a sin. And that confuses people. Well, then what's the difference between a depravity and a sin? They go on and say it's a crime to be punished by the judges, crimes to be punished by the sword, crimes of end, which means to bring an end or destruction to someone or something. So it's not really clear what iniquity is. But you realize most Christians have heard that verse where it says, not all sin leads to death. There are sins that we can commit that you don't go to hell over. In fact, there's pretty much only one sin listed in the Bible. Well, I shouldn't say pretty much. There is only one sin listed in the Bible that cannot be forgiven, that will for sure send a person to hell. Living a lifestyle to what, I should say that differently. What the Christians think of as hell does not line up with the Bible. That comes from Persia. What the Jews call hell is something very different and tends to line up with the Bible. But there, just suffice to say, there is a hell. There is a place of eternal regret, which is punishment. You can look at that as punishment, but it's self-inflicted. So there are some things, you can commit a sin, and the only penalty is you got to stop committing the sin. There are some sins you commit that the penalty is, well, there has to be a sacrifice made. Maybe you have to go back to somebody and apologize. Maybe you have to go back to somebody and make restitution. And then there are sins where you're going to get punished. If you're following Torah, the leadership of your congregation is literally supposed to punish you. And then the punishments, of course, go higher and higher up to the point of uh, a person going to this thing, hell. Why do I say it this way? Well, because the Bible is not very clear on what hell is or is not. They call it Sheol in Hebrew, but what it exactly is not terribly clear. We do know it's nothing like Persia, but beyond that, we don't know a lot. So iniquity could be described in this way, and they say perversity. Well, what's perversity? Well, you know what happened. As soon as they began to, in the English language, type perversity to, I'm looking for a word other than the one that's coming to mind. Physically wrong things, things that people do physically that are wrong. Gosh, how do I say this delicately? Do you know what I'm talking about? Perversity, like hiring particular people for particular services. Is that clear enough? When they began to tie it to that type of thing, it completely and utterly lost its meaning, because perversity in the Bible is not that at all. It had nothing to do with it. You could tie it to it because that's a wrong thing to do, right? So you could make that connection, but that's not what the word means. The word perversity is better understood as, okay, so the wife goes to the husband and says, look, I'd really like to have this picture hanging on that wall, but I can't reach it. It's too high. So the husband, he goes and he gets himself a nail, and he can't find the hammer, so he grabs a screwdriver. And he puts the nail on the wall, and he takes the end of the screwdriver and bangs the nail into the wall. And then he hangs the picture. And we know that it worked, right? Because you can bang a nail with a hammer, or you can bang it with a rock, or you can bang it with a what we used to call a pipe wrench. You can bang it with a solid stick, if as long as it doesn't have to go into something really, really hard. But sheetrock, generally, you can use a stick from outside, right? Or the wrong, the fat end of a screw, the part you hold on to, you can turn it around and you can bang it into the wall. That is a better understanding of perversity. What do I mean by that? Well, I took a screwdriver, which was designed to go into the back of a screw and turn. I turned it upside down and perverted its use. Even though it worked, and even though I committed no crime or sin here, I used something in a manner that it was not intended to be used. That's what they mean by perversity. It has nothing to do with those other crimes and those other things that are so awful that I don't even want to talk about them. It doesn't have anything to do with that. But you could see how they could tie that to it, right? Because people are not supposed to be used in that manner. There's supposed to be love involved. There's supposed to be uh, covenant involved. If for those of you who know what I'm talking about, so you can see how that's why they would call that perversity, because something is being done in a way that it wasn't intended. And that's what you have to understand, is something is being done in a way it wasn't intended. If we were designed by God to live according to the Torah and we don't, we have perverted the design, the very design that God came up with. So you have to think of this word, avanotai, in those terms. Something about our life is not being lived the way we were designed to live it. We were not designed to be hateful, angry people. And when we become hateful, angry people, we have perverted the design for which we were created. All right. So then the next word is avru, which is go over they, literally. So they go over. It's to pass over, to cross. You're going from one side of a stream to the other, so you've passed over the stream. Even though you probably walked through it, you've passed over to the other side, have you not? When they say they pass over to something. But it's more, the better way to think of it is when the water rises, they're having a flash flood or something, and the water is passing over the banks. That's the more common use of this word. So you can be going across, from one place to another, or it's the rising of the water passing over the banks. It's all of that's the same thing with avru. So then it says roshi. That's head or head me. It's my head, right? Because remember, they say things correctly, and we in English say everything backwards. It's pretty much the only language that does it backwards. Everybody else does it the other way. So we're the ones that are actually wrong. Anyway, so it's my head. It's a noun. It's just this thing here. Then it says kemasa, and they say as a burden. It's from the word masa, or the root asa. It's a bearing, it's a carrying, it's a burden, it's a load which is carried, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to most people. That to which the soul lifts itself up, what it desires, something uttered, a sentence, especially something uttered by God or a prophet. Okay, what are they saying? This is from the idea of something lifting up. So they use pride. If we're lifted up in pride, it's to be lifted up, right? We're thinking that we're somehow greater than what we are. But it's from that root asa, which is of the water lifting up the ark. The water lifted it up. So you see why they talk about pride. You have in pride in the English world has become a bad thing. Pride was not supposed to be a bad thing. We were created in God's image, and God had pride. If God did not have pride, we wouldn't have pride. We were given the attributes of God. I mean, we're talking, this is our scale and God's that, right? I mean, but God had pride, did he not? He created something and he stepped back and he looked at it and said, this is perfect. This is perfect. This is perfect. He was proud of himself, right? And so to be proud of your accomplishments is not wrong. Pride is not wrong until you lift that pride up and make it way bigger than it's supposed to be. It's good to step back and, you built a house, and it's good to step back and be proud of yourself for your accomplishment. But when you get to the point where you're saying that house couldn't have been built unless I did it, I'm the one, I'm the guy. Without me, a house couldn't be built. You see where now you've lifted up the pride, you've lifted up that good part of pride and turned it into something it shouldn't be. So that's why they use it of pride. It's because when that pride gets beyond what it should be, then you're lifted up in pride, and that becomes a negative thing. But being proud of your accomplishments in and of itself is not wrong. So we're not talking pride here. We're talking about a burden, and we tend to think of a burden as something that's heavy and weighs us down, right? So you realize in Hebrew, every word has an opposite. For instance, Baruch. What do we think of as Baruch? Blessed are you, O Lord God, creator of the universe, right? Baruch atah Yahweh Eloheinu, melech haolam. We know that word, and we know that it's blessing. And if you've been around me very long, you know that it's to bend at the knee. But what happens when a camel bends at the knee? Because that's what the connection is. That's what the picture is. It's a camel. It's the camel bending at the knee. But what happens? You're either putting the burden on or you're unloading the burden, right? So you can see where the picture is happening here of the loading down. So if you can offload a burden, then you can unload a burden. So the word masa, though it is generally thought of more of the unloading, of the lifting up, and the, you take off the weight and your shoulders get bigger, get higher, and all that. It's also the opposite. So Baruch, that we think of as a blessing, can become what? A cursing. Every word in Hebrew has its opposite, and this word is used in such a way in this sentence that it's the opposite. Instead of it being something that's lifted off, it's something that's put on, and that's why they used it, why it's translated in English as burden, and that is the correct way to use it here, because that's the way they mean it. Which is why you don't get a King James, good Lord, why you don't get a Strong's Concordance, because the Strong's Concordance is going to tell you all of those things. It's up, it's down, it's heavy, it's light, and then you go in there, and whatever feels good to you is what you put in your translation, right? Or you put both in your translation. No, 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 no. You can't do that. But that's what so many people do, because they don't understand that only one of these things, one of these explanations is going to apply to this sentence, not all of them. And you're not allowed to just pick one because it feels good to you. You have to follow the rules. There are grammar rules in the Hebrew language. All right. So this is followed by haver, which is, I thought this was from haverim. This is kavod. I had that wrong a while ago. I'm looking at that. Whoops. But it's haver, which is from kavod, and it's to be heavy. So they say to be heavy, to bear up under anything, to endure adversity. Because the adversity pushes down. It feels like it's crushing you, right? And so they use that as part of the image. It's to be great, vehement, plentiful, of enormity, of wickedness, of a battle becoming fierce. In a bad sense, to be troublesome and burdensome. And we've already established that they're using the word as the previous word is burden, and not a burden being lifted, but one weighing you down. So you're going to stay in the same, what's the word I'm looking for here? You're going to stay in the negative. You don't go back and forth in Hebrew. If it's negative, it stays negative, unless you find a verb without possession, then it changes. But that's a whole different story. So we're staying. So now we have now it's a burden, and so now it's heavy. So what am I telling you? It can be the opposite of heavy, right? It can be weighty, or it can be unweighty. But in this case, it's weighty because it's used in a bad sense. Then it says yich vedu, which is literally he, heavy, they. They are heavy. It's in the masculine. It's to be heavy, also laden, grievous, burdensome. You see what's happening here? They're essentially beginning to use different words to say the same thing. So they're adding some emphasis, right? It's of a heavy famine. It's of enormous sin, laden with iniquity, to be difficult, to be hard. And it is from the word kavod. So they literally are using the same word twice. It makes it even more important, doesn't it? That heavy, to be, it's pushing down and it's weighty. Let me tell you how that can be a good thing. Let's say you go to the temple of God and the presence of God is there. What's going to happen? It's going to be heavy. It's going to be good, right? It's going to be the heavy weightiness of the presence of God. That's what some people experience, that they say, oh, that must be the Holy Ghost. No, that's not the Holy Ghost. That's the presence of God Almighty. So let's not get those confused. But it's described as a weight, and that's the good version of it. And then the last word here, I think it's the last word. Yeah, the last word is mimini, which is from me. It's a part taken from a whole. It's, like you take a pie and you cut it up and you take a part from the whole. That's the from part. So it's from me. Literally, it's just from me. So here's my amplified, unintelligible version of it. It's, remember, we're in Tehillim. That's Psalm 38:4. Because my perversity, depravity, and sin have overflowed my head, because that's where it starts, right? It all comes from here. I hope we all know that. Sin doesn't sneak up behind us and jump on us and knock us down, and sin originates right here. Because my perversity, depravity, and sin have overflowed my head as a heavy, enormous, and troublesome burden, too heavy, enormous, and troublesome for me. Okay, you're like, huh? But you kind of get the idea, right? It's because my perversity, you know, it came from my mind, because the perversity of my mind is too heavy for me. That's probably the easiest way to think of what this verse is. So I found something in the Sepharim Shelahim, what we call the New Testament. It's the letter to the Galatians. It's in chapter 6, and then we begin with verse 1. And I want to take you through the words of several of these verses from 1 on down, because there's some powerful stuff here that we really need to understand. It starts off in Greek, adelphoi. You hear Philadelphia, adelpho. You guys hear the word for brother? Because Philadelphia, brotherly love. Adelphi, so hopefully you hear it. We use the word achi in Hebrew. That's my brother. Then it says an in Greek, which is gam in Hebrew, and it just means also. This kai, which is the conjunction and. Then our next word is prolempte in Greek. It's we use the word in Hebrew tafas, overtaken. So we're saying if a brother is overtaken, to be overtaken is to take hold on anyone, hence to take men in war, to take hold of the name of Yahweh, which is, what they mean by that is to do violence in the name of God by perjury, which is what the Crusaders did. They went and they gathered up all the Jews and put them inside their synagogues and locked them in and burned it down. And they did that in the name of God. To hold as a city, hence to handle, to wield as a sickle, to enclose in gold, to overlay. It's to overwhelm, right? It's to overtake. This man has been taken in the war. He is overlaid with this fault. He is enclosed by it. He is covered with it. This is very different than someone who sins from time to time. Do you follow what's being said? If he's overtaken in this sin, if it has just consumed him, it has just taken over his life. What happens when somebody becomes an alcoholic? They're overtaken with this, right? They get to a place where nothing is going to stop them from getting their next drink. Drug addicts do the same thing. These, of course, really extreme examples, but that's what this word overtaken, that's what they're really talking about. Somebody has just really become overtaken in something. Well, it's going to be sin. Anthropos, that's the word for man. We say ish in Hebrew. And then it says en in Greek, which is be in Hebrew, and it's the word in the house. It's in Hebrew. And then we've got a word that's really just a grammatical thing after that, tini, which doesn't really mean much of anything. But then we follow that with paraptomati in Greek, which is ma'al in Hebrew. If he's overtaken with a fault. I've got perfidy. I think that's supposed to be perversity. Treachery, sin against God. That's what they call a fault. It's from the root, which is to act treacherously, to be faithless. Not faithful, but faithless. Not that they don't believe in something, but that they're not living out the Torah. To sin against Yahweh, to turn aside from him, to whisper, to backbite. It's used of deceit and fraud. To seize, to take by stealth. That's lying. And what they call treachery, doing things. It's like the Sadducees that got together looking for a way to kill Yeshua. You know, that it's that type of thing. The primary signification is of covering, which is to say that it's to act covertly. And then the word is you, umis or umes in Greek, rather. It's ata in Hebrew. You who are pneumatikoi. Do you hear pneumatic there? Pneumatikoi, pneumatic. Those of you who are ruach. Those of you, they say in English, you are spiritual. Now, everybody thinks they're spiritual, right? Oh, yeah, me and Jesus, we got our own thing going. I'm over here being spiritual, right? We better understand what spiritual is in the Bible times, right? What did it mean to the men who wrote this? Let's not talk about what it means to Joe Schmo on the street. Let's talk about what it meant to the person who wrote this letter. They use the word ruach. It means spirit. It's of breath. It's of wind. It's of breath from the mouth, from the nostrils. Used of snorting, even because if you're breathing hard, if you're breathing heavy, like you've been running down the street, you're breathing hard. Your nostrils move in and out from the hard breathing, and they use it for that. Of course, they use it for the breeze of the day, and they talk about that in the Bereshit, in Genesis. This is the ruach of God was moving in the ruach of the day, or God was walking in the ruach of the day, the breeze of the day. He wasn't walking in the Holy Ghost. He was walking in the breeze of the day. So here's a note that I put in here. It's clear that all these passages alike speak of the Spirit of God himself and not of any wind supposed to be moved by the breath of God. So there was an argument that was going on in the 1800s. This note actually came from the Gesenius, not something I wrote. But there was this argument going on by some of the scholars that were big name scholars in the 1800s, early to mid 1800s, and some were saying that that it was the Spirit of God. Because they're Trinitarian, so they're talking about, okay, so the third person of God was walking around and not God himself, and others were saying it. But what Jusinius said, it's clear that all these passages alike speak of the Spirit of God himself and not any wind supposed to be moved, because others were saying, no, it's just the wind blowing. Well, they were right. It was just the wind blowing. Because you have to understand, in the Tanakh, there was no Trinity. And I know people will argue that. Well, it says, let us make man in our image. Well, you understand that's English, right? That's not Hebrew. It doesn't say, let us make man in our image in Hebrew. It's written in plural in Hebrew, not because there's more than one. It's written in plural because he's a living God. If he's a living God, he has many attributes, and they write it in plural. If he's a statue, he has one attribute, and they write it in singular. So it had nothing to do with more than one. It's of the breath of life. It's of the what they call the vital principle, which meant it's that thing that makes you live. The rational mind or spirit was used in this way, the seat of the senses, the affections of the emotions. And they said that because your spirit lives on after you die. And so your spirit, your ruach, was that part of you. They called it the rational mind, or the seat of the senses and the affections and emotions, because it was the real you. It was the part of you that lived on after you die. So can you use all of this to describe what they're saying here? No. Only one of these things is going to be right for this verse. And so they're using the word spiritual. Those of you who are spiritual. Okay, so the explanation given doesn't tell us what spiritual is. That's the problem. Well, is spiritual the wind that's blowing? is spiritual the part of, you're already died and you're floating around, so it's the Caspary people floating around, they're supposed to do something? Well, probably not. Who's going to jump on that band? Well, somebody's going to, but maybe not anyone in this room. All right, so then is it the Spirit of God? No, probably not. Oh, so it's someone who's filled with the Spirit of God. Well, we're getting close. We're getting close. Not exactly. What did they call the Spirit of God in the first century? The Torah. Those of you who are knowledgeable, which is to be filled with the Spirit of God, the Torah, now it comes into place what spiritual is. Those who are spiritual are the people who are who know the Torah. And who would that be? The rabbi, the rabbim, because there's going to be lots of rabbis, right? It's going to be the doctors of the law. It's going to be the scribes. Because you realize that scribes, that's not a sect of Judaism. You realize that, right? Because every sect, whether it was the Parashim, which they call the Pharisees, they had scribes. The Essene, the ECE, or Essenes as they're called now, they had scribes. Who else was the Zadokim, the Sadducees? They had scribes. The Hasidim, they had scribes. Everybody had scribes, right? So, but if you were a scribe, that meant you knew your Torah, because they didn't let just anybody write. Just because you could write Hebrew didn't mean you were allowed to be a scribe. You had to be a doctor of the law before you could be a scribe. So those of you who are spiritual, those of you who know the law, those of you who are rabbim, doctors of the law, scribes of the law, those are the ones he's talking about, and we have to know that. Then that's followed in Greek by katartizete, which is in place. We use the word Hebrew yasat. It's restore. Those of you who know the law, you're supposed to restore. It's to place, to set, to found. We think of restore as you're fixing something. Look at this word, place, to set, to found. It's used poetically of God as founding the heavens and the earth. Those of you who know the Torah set a foundation. So even though they say restore, you really need to be thinking in terms of build, lay a foundation. This is not restoration. Being caught in a fault indicates that this person lacks a foundation and needs to be taught something that will establish a foundation in him or her. You wouldn't want to return or restore his thinking because it wasn't right to begin with. The need is to establish, not to restore. And the word means establish. But as, again, words are used in different ways in both Greek and Hebrew. And in the translating of this verse, the wrong meaning was picked in the English text. So we have to think of establish, not restore. Then it's tone, toiauton, which is you're getting back to you got to restore this man. And then it's en, which is we say in English. So you got to restore pneumati. Do you hear pneumatic? Remember this word, the ruach. You have to restore, or not restore. You have to found the Spirit. You have to found the Torah in this person. Then it's in Greek, it's paltetos. It's the Praetorians. It's the same word, but in Hebrew we say anava, which is you have to restore meekness. It's a lowly mind. It's modesty, commonly with the added notion of lowly. And remember, this is coming from something written in the 1800s. The next thing it said pious. And what they did was everywhere it used to say Torah observant, they replaced that with pious. So if you're looking at something from the 1800s and it says pious, mark out pious and write Torah observant. That's what they really mean. And then it says in modest mind, which prefers to bear injuries rather than return them, to be meek, to be gentle. It is from the root ana, kind of like the name Anna, not exactly. To bestow labor upon anything, to exercise oneself in anything, to till the ground, to bring the earth into cultivation, to be afflicted, depressed, oppressed. Doesn't even sound like it goes together, does it? It's the lowly mind. I'm just a speck. I'm only dust in the wind. Just think of meekness. Then it's skopon is our next word in Greek, and that's zaphai in Hebrew. It's considering. Now you're supposed to correct the doctrine here. You're supposed to correct them with the Torah. You're correcting whatever this behavior is that's against Torah. You're showing them what the Torah says to correct them, and it says to do it in meekness. It's telling the corrector to do that in meekness. And then it says skopon in Greek, safa in Hebrew. It's to consider, to shine, to be bright, hence to look out, to view properly, to enlighten with the eyes. Is used of a tower which has a wide view, a watchman set on a tower, metaphorically used of prophets, who, like watchmen, declare future events as being divinely revealed to them by visions, hence to look out for, to observe accurately. You got to look at what you're doing here. You got to observe yourself. You got to make sure that sialton, or the nafshi, my soul, the breath of life, the soul, the anima. It's not the word ruach, is it? The soul, the anima by which the body lives, the token of which life is drawing breath, hence life itself. Vital principles, what they used to call it in the old days. The mind as the seat of the senses, the affections, and various emotions. Sounds like the same thing, doesn't it? Well, it kind of is. It's the part of you that lives on. It's your soul. Nafshi, nafesh, that's your soul. So you got to consider your own soul, it's saying. You got to, how are they putting that? You got to be, because you as the prophet know that if you become lifted up in pride, if you don't do this in the correct way, then you already know what your future is going to be, what the future is going to be for your soul. Then it says may in Greek, which is pan in Hebrew. The word may is used in different ways in Greek. It's usually the negative article, but not always. And in this case, it's used for, we say lest in English, which is not a word we use a lot anymore. It's still a conjunction, but it's a conjunction of removing, prohibiting, hindering. So you better consider this and think about your own soul, lest, and then he's going to tell you, because something else could happen. Let us build for ourselves a city, lest we be scattered abroad. So that this other thing doesn't happen. And this is Gam, so we're saying lest, Gam, which is also, Atam, Ata, you, lest you, Peraste in Greek, Zaraf in Hebrew, examine in English, which is to melt. It's used of melting metal. Is that called smelting? Is that the right word?
Smeltering, yeah.
Schmeltering?
Go to a smelter.
To melt metal, especially to purge gold or silver by fire, and to separate it from the dross, metaphorically to prove, to examine anyone, also to purge. So it's, you better examine your own soul here. So the question is, did you catch it? He just told us that we too will be tried by the fire, and the dross will be removed from our lives if we don't do this right. So we better check our self-righteous attitudes at the door, or we ourselves will be purged by fire. This is why it's supposed to be the doctors of the law doing this, and not just the average Joe Schmo. Amplified translation, and we've only gotten through the first verse. Brothers, if a man is overcome, enclosed, and covered over by a sin, by treachery against Yahweh, if he is hiding, whispering, backbiting, acting deceitful and fraudulently and rebelling, you who are filled with the Spirit, you who know the Torah, need to place, you need to set, you need to establish a foundation in such a person in the spirit of lowliness, modesty, gentleness, watching your own souls, lest you also be purged by fire like metal to separate the dross from your lives, from your lives. This is something you better really be careful with. So here's a regular translation, my translation of the Greek text. Also Torah observant ones, because you realize the brothers are the Torah observant ones. No one else is considered a brother in the first century. Also Torah observant ones, if a man is caught in a Torah rebellion, if he's caught in a sin, you which are Torah teachers, you which are spiritual, restore such in the spirit of humility, being careful that you are not also tested. Caught in Torah rebellion, not the fault. Those who are spiritual are those who know the Torah well enough to know whether a person has committed Torah rebellion or whether a person has committed sin. Since we know this, why? Because First John chapter, if for no other reason, we know it because First John chapter 3 verse 4 tells us that sin is Torah, rebellion. Yes, that's New Testament. It tells us that sin is Torah, rebellion. First John chapter 3 verse 4. So it's telling us quite clearly that those who are spiritual are those who know the Torah well enough to know whether a person has committed a Torah rebellion or not. If you don't know the Torah well enough, you can't decide whether it's right or wrong. You may be wrong about that. And I've seen that so many times in my life, growing up in the Christian church, people going off correcting people for things they thought were sin. That were not sin. Sin is Torah rebellion. So if the Torah doesn't tell you that this is wrong, it's not wrong. It doesn't matter how vile you think it is or feel that it is, or it doesn't matter. If the Bible itself doesn't call it sin, it's not sin. And I've seen that over the years. I've seen people trying to correct other people's behaviors because they feel those behaviors are wrong. And I'll give you a real outlandish example here. It's one of the things that's got America in so much trouble right now. Christians who were not doctors of the law, who didn't know the law, going out and trying to correct the behavior of other people. Well, first off, a doctor of the law knows that the law that we only correct those who live according to the law. We're not supposed to correct those who don't, because those who don't are not brethren. And this said brothers, didn't it? Started right off saying brothers. And so we're supposed to only correct the brothers. So first off, there's our first mistake. And, in the Christian world, they began to believe that they were there to correct everybody's mistake. So since they believe that certain practices among certain people were sinful, they wouldn't allow certain things. They made laws that made it so that only a man and a woman could be called married. And because of the resentment of those who didn't fall within that category, look where we are now. This is why the spiritual are supposed to do the correcting and not just the average schmo. You follow what I'm saying? I mean, that's a really extreme case, but there's many extreme cases like that. They weren't supposed to correct the behavior of non-brothers. And that turned into rage for certain people. And they were going to get back at the church at all costs, no matter what it was. And it's the same thing. Somebody not making a cupcake. Those people were charged $150,000 in fines. They lost their company and all of that. Why? Because something that they did or didn't do wrong? No. Because the church decided to correct the behavior of the non-brothers. They stepped over the line. They did something they should never have done. So it needs to be left to the ones who are the doctors of the law. They're the ones that know who are supposed to be corrected and who are not. And they know what is sin and what isn't sin. This scripture, this verse that we just did, does not give free rein for us to go around correcting the actions of those who are doing things we personally find offensive. Additionally, this charge was given to the brothers, not the children. The children are under tutors until the time comes when they know the Torah enough to know what Torah rebellion is and what it is not, and are mature enough to do things in love and not anger. These things are very important. Verse 2, I'm going to start kind of skipping through some things. I don't think we have to go through everything, but we have the word alelon, which sounds like Alan. Alelon. Anyway, I see it. It's in the word re'ehu in Hebrew. It's a friend, a companion, someone that when it says that you have conversation with them, it's someone who, it's like somebody you know better, they know you better than you know yourself. So uh, think about it along those terms. It's more like a married couple. And then they have bare, which in Hebrew is masa. Now we've already had this word. That's the burden word. That's the thing crushing down, or it can be lifting up. And in this case, it's crushing down. And then we have basta zete, which is the word nasa. So this is the lifting up. It's the same word, but it's so we got the crushing down and the lifting up. So you're being pushed from both sides. It's like you're being smushed. Wow, I got a lot of information on that one. Then we have the conjunction that says altos, which is hayats, they will be. And then we have anaplerosete. No, we haven't had this. I was thinking we had that word, but we haven't. It's from the Hebrew word malah, which is fulfill, to make full. The original idea is that of abundance, overflowing. And the image is generally used of someone taking a big jug of water and you turn it over and start guzzling it down, and it's pouring all over you as well as you're drinking it, but it's pouring all over you, and so it's abundance. You have plenty of water. You're not worried about, oh, I got to sip it real carefully because I don't want to lose any water. This is abundant. I have so much I can just pour it on myself and it won't matter. To fulfill is, so you got to connect that idea to an overflowing abundance. The glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. So it's not that it filled every crack and crevice and stopped. No, this is abundance. It wasn't just filled. It went on past the walls. It went on past the ceiling. You know what I'm saying? Because it's an abundance. It's way beyond full. Then we have noman in Greek. Nomos, noman. It's the Greek word for Torah, instruction, doctrine. Torah is not the Hebrew word for law. It is the Hebrew word for instruction. And it comes from yara, which is to cast, to lay a foundation, to place a foundation. So we're staying in the same place. And then it says Christou, which is pretty much a word that they use. Christou in Greek means anointed. And the reason why they use the word Christou, which eventually becomes Christ in the English translations, is not because his name was Christ. There was nobody named Jesus Christ. I said at one time that Christ was not Jesus' last name, and I freaked some people out. They're like, what? Are you serious? Yeah, it wasn't a last name. They said it because when you said Mashiach, nobody knew what that was. They didn't have a word for Messiah in the Greek language. So since Mashiach comes from the root that means anointed, they used Christou because it means anointed. So Christ, Christou, it really doesn't mean what we should always put Messiah in its place because they're talking about the Messiah. Unless, of course, they're talking about anointing a priest or something. They will use that same word. So in verse 2, my translation, well, the Amplified translation is lift up and carry away. That's that asa, your intimate friends, burdensome heavy loads, existing in overflowing abundance, fulfilling and completing the Torah of the Messiah. And again, in those type of translations, they don't make any sense. So here's the regular translation. Carry one another's burdens and thus fulfill the Torah of Mashiach. The Torah belongs to Mashiach. He would never get rid of that thing that belongs to him. But carrying one another's. He ain't heavy, he's my brother. Oh, well, I don't know. Some of them weigh a lot, and they are kind of heavy, I'm saying. No, see, that was the thing. When you didn't realize that this was only for the brothers, then we get all lofty and noble with our thinking, and everybody becomes our brother, which is kind of an excuse for, if you're nosy, to be in everybody's business. No, this is for the Torah observant ones. This is only for the brothers. Your only brother is the one who's Torah observant, as it is assumed that, like you, who we're assuming is Torah observant. These were Torah observant people talking about their Torah observant brothers. That's what made them brothers, was the fact that they were all Torah observant. So you carry the other one's burdens, and you've got to help this person out. And you do that by laying a foundation of the Mashiach, the Torah of Mashiach in them. And again, it's not Joe Schmo, it's the doctrine of the law. In verse 3, it says, because, if you will, doke in Hebrew, or hashav in Hebrew, which is to think, it's to meditate. The primary idea seems to be that of computing and reckoning. It's the same word they use for God reckoned that Abraham was righteous. He computed it. He reckoned it to him. It's more frequently used in a bad sense, though, to devise evil, to plot against someone, to think or purpose something, to think, to take, to be so-and-so, to make much account of, to esteem, to prize, to impute. It's to impute something to someone. All right, so then we have Ani, which is that it will be, and then it's T, which is the Greek word. In Hebrew, it's me'umah, which is something or anything. Then it's in Greek, it's maiden, and that we use ayin in Hebrew, and that's nothing or emptiness. It's vacuity. And then it's phrenapata, which is in place of the Hebrew word mirma, which is deceives. It's to defraud. It's to be fraudulent. It's of using the weights. You had somebody comes with gold, and you got a weight that it says 50 ounces on it, but it's really only 20, and you put that over here, and they stick theirs over here, and you say, see, you only have 20 ounces when you really have 50, so you defraud them. And they use that of the weights of the scale, of people using fake weights. It's from the root rama, which is to cast, to throw, to shoot with a bow. In this case, it's NPL, and you got to know that. It's to beguile, to deceive, properly to throw down, to trip up somebody. Our next word is that nefesh word, that soul word. So here's the amplified, no one can understand it version. Because a man who thinks, meditates, or reckons, one who makes much account of, esteems, and believes himself to exist as something when he is nothing, deceives, beguiles, trips up his own soul. So this isn't just a general message to all men. This is a message to the men who are spiritual and engaging in setting a foundation in a person who is overcome with sin. So here's my translation, my regular translation. For if anyone think he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. And before I go on, let me say this. We all lofty thinking in the Western world think that we can outthink God, and what we do with this one is we say that, oh, see, I'm nothing. I don't think of myself as something. Well, wait a minute. I am something. I'm a rabbi. I have achieved that. Over here we have a school teacher. Over here we have a bus driver. Over there we have a secretary. We're all something. But if we think that we are something that we're not, if we think we are something, I'm the greatest bus driver in the world. Okay, now we have a problem. I'm the greatest teacher in the world. Now we have a problem. I'm the greatest rabbi. Well, that's true, but you knew it was coming. No, I can't go there because then I begin to think I'm something when I'm nothing. I'm not beyond that. And if I go to a man thinking that I can correct his foundation when I don't know what the foundation is, I'm deceiving myself. Anyway, in verse 4, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice here. In verse 4, we start off with the Greek word day. It's in place of the Hebrew word aval, which is indeed. Truly, indeed, nothing really big there, I don't think. And then we have ergon in Greek, which is maaseh. That's works. That's deeds. That which anyone does, an action, a work. It's the thing that the Christians are so scared of. If his own deeds, because it's going to be followed with altal in Greek. It's heave in Hebrew, which is attached to the end of a word. His own, and then they say dokimazeto in Greek, which is bahan in Hebrew, examine, to search out, to examine, to try, to prove. It's use of the metals. If he doesn't examine himself. And then it says ekastos, which is totality. It's kol in Hebrew. And then we have, it's connected to the word ish as well, so it's all men. There's a conjunction after that, and then there's, it's like, and then in himself, because it's the same word, alton. Then monon, which we use levado or alone. It's to separate. It's a part. And it's not like a part taken from a whole, which obviously, well, it's not a part that's taken from the whole. But once you take a part from a whole and you set it over here, it's alone. It's all by itself. This is really what we're talking about. Something that is separate from everything else. Um, And then we go to the word tehillah in Hebrew, which is praise, worship. It's halal in the root, which is of clear sounds, because the praising of God comes with sound and all that kind of stuff. So it used of singing praises, speaking praises, having a joyful celebration. It's then that's followed with a conjunction, and then with a negative article, and then it's followed with the Greek word ace, which is in place of the Hebrew word neged, which is opposite. And the way they describe an opposite is they say in front. So if this is one person and this person is facing this person, they are opposite, but they're facing each other. That's the Hebrew way of looking at it. What else do we have here? Yeah, we're about to run out of words here. And then it's another. The last thing is another. So the unintelligible version of 6:4 is, but to the contrary, let absolutely every man search out, examine, and watch over the deeds, actions, and works of his hands. And then a celebration, and glory will exist in him alone and not before the face of another. So let's go with a good translation here. But let each of us examine our own work. Now remember who's being spoken to. Not Joe Schmo, not everybody on the street. Remember, he's talking specifically to the doctors of the law. Let each of us examine our own work, and then we shall have boasting in ourselves alone, and not in another. In other words, I can't go over here and think that I'm going to correct this man's behavior, and that's some great thing that I've done. We have to examine our own works and our own deeds, the things that we're doing. When we go to somebody and say, hey, you got to stop this backbiting because the law says you're not allowed to, the first thing we better do is examine ourselves and say, am I doing that? Gave us a really good example of all people. He gave us a really good example of this in a story about Gandhi. I mean, we don't know. Maybe the story isn't true. Maybe it is. But there's a story about Gandhi where this woman brings her son to Gandhi, and her son is a little plump, and she goes to Gandhi. He's at some meet and greet thing, and she waits in line and waits and waits and waits. She finally gets up there, and she asks him to tell her son to stop eating sugar. And Gandhi looks at the boy and looks at the woman and says, come back in 1 week and ask me again. And so they go away. A week later, they come back to another meet and greet, and they have to wait and wait and wait. The lines are really, really long. She finally gets back up there, and Gandhi looks at the little boy and talks to him for a little bit and gets him to promise that he's going to lay off the sugar. And so the little boy runs off to play, and the mother looks at Gandhi and says, well, but why didn't you do that last week? And Gandhi said to her, well, I had to lay off the sugar before I could ask someone else to lay off the sugar. Because he believed in leading by example. This is what we're talking about. This is a good, I mean, that story fits this verse. But let each of us examine our own work, and then we'll have boasting in what we've done. Because we can't boast in what they've done. If they change their way, it's because God has touched their heart with his word. Not because we're so brilliant that we got them to change their way. So we need to make sure our life is right before we go and begin to try to help someone else. Because if our life is right and we're doing what's right and we're teaching what's right, then God's Spirit, if you will, his word, is not hindered in some way. Because if I ask a boy to lay off the sugar, you're not going to catch me doing it. Sugar is good. Sugar is our friend. You get what I'm saying. I got to be living the life, and I can only be responsible for myself. And if I'm doing what's right, then I have boasting in myself. And he is talking specifically about the doctors of the law, you can apply that to your own life, can't you? You could put that, whatever you've learned from the doctor of the law that you're learning from, if you're putting that into play into your own life and you're working on that, don't you have boasting in yourself? And haven't I already explained that boasting is not really bad? We should be proud of our accomplishments. If we can look back over the last 5 years or so and say, I have really grown, isn't that what we're supposed to do? Shouldn't we be allowed to be proud of our accomplishments? Of course we should. It's when we pervert it, when we take our accomplishment and turn it upside down and use it as a hammer, that's when we've messed it up. I'm just going to blow through verse 5, I think. The Amplified Version comes out, because every man lifts up and carries his own burdensome heavy load. My translation of it was, for everyone bears his own burden. We all have a burden to carry. Everyone has some kind of weight on their shoulder. Balance comes when we help each other with our heavy loads. When the doctor of the law recognizes it, and he goes to the brother and he helps to lay the foundation. He helps to set someone on the right path. So if it becomes too much for you, go to the doctor of the law. He's not a mind reader. He doesn't know what you're doing at home. Yes, he is heavy, and he is your brother if he is in fact Torah observant like you, but he's not your brother if he's not. Do you suffer from a loathsome disease? Are you the enemy of someone lost in sin? Are you the one lost in sin? Are you the enemy of Yahweh as it was described? Or are you wrapped up in the sin? Are you the enemy of someone overtaken in his sin, or do you consider your own soul and help out your brother? It's a good way to live, isn't it? Will you consider things from the point of view of the transgressor, knowing that you are a transgressor yourself? Or will you stand against him? Will you bear your own burden and not someone else's? Or do you bear your own burden wishing someone would help you? It is a good thing to bear one another's burdens, because in doing so, we lighten our own load. So if you feel weighed down by this thing, you need to talk to the doctor of the law and let him help you with this thing. So this is a really long-winded way for me to say, you guys are like my children. You never call. You never write. I'm sorry. I couldn't help myself. Standing in judgment of another, which is what he was telling us not to do, is a place of guilt on ourselves. We can't go off doing that. The scriptures teach us to confess our faults to one another, not our sins. But maybe it's time for someone to step up and say, I refuse to judge you. I'm here to help you. This would be a good thing, right? Maybe it's time for someone to step up and say, I will help establish the foundation in you, no matter what you've done, not because I'm so great, but because you're so great. Isn't this what we should be able to expect from our rabbi? I hope so. I hope that if you're weighed down by something, that you can come to me and let me help you find a way to work through this. And if so, then you can be like that camel on its knees with the burden coming off rather than the burden going on. Shalom, Shalom.